from the 2nd chapter of Luke, verses 41 to 52. Now every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended, they started to return. The boy, Jesus, stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. Then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." He said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor. Well, it's the day after Christmas, and Jesus is now, all of a sudden, in our readings, 12 years old. Wow, where did the time go? Actually, that question of where the time goes, that's kind of how we structure our liturgical calendar year in and year out. We know that Jesus grows to be a curious and wise 12-year-old, and then a compassionate and prophetic adult, and then a radical and redemptive Savior. But we need to take time to rehearse and relive these stories every year in order to rehearse and relive our response. Most of us are probably pretty familiar with Jesus' story. The particular narrative we heard earlier it's significant. It's because it's really the only story we have in the canonical books, the Gospels, about Jesus between his birth and his baptism nearly 30 years later. In this story, Jesus' family, like Samuel's, had traveled for a big holiday. And as we join into the story, they had traveled with a large caravan from Nazareth to the temple in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. After the festivities, the group began the long journey home. Although it probably seems kind of weird to us that Mary and Joseph took a whole day to miss Jesus, that really wouldn't have been all that unusual in this time. It wasn't uncommon for children to visit or travel with other families in the same caravan, and Jesus' parents would not have been neglectful to assume that Jesus was among that group. That would have been very understandable. So we can all imagine Mary and Joseph's panic when they discovered that Jesus was missing. Probably all of us have temporarily lost a child somewhere, whether we're babysitting or whether it's our own child. I can remember times when I would take a stepdaughter to a store, and they would hide in the clothing racks, and I couldn't find them, and I would panic. We all know that grip of fear and that adrenaline rush as we search for the child. So Mary and Joseph experience that same thing, and they leave the caravan and they rush back to Jerusalem, where it takes 3 days of diligent searching to finally find him. If this were one of those police procedurals, we'd be panicking by now, thinking that's way too long, and if you don't find the child in the first 48 hours, they're gone. Anyway, while they had been madly searching, Jesus, he'd been sitting in the temple. He'd been absorbing the teachings of the rabbis. Luke tells us that everyone who observed him were amazed at his level of understanding and at the depth of the questions that he was asking and the answers that he was sharing with the teachers. But Jesus' parents, they were not so amused or even impressed. Understandably, they scolded him for the great anxiety they caused him. Now, how many of us have had someone in our charge, and they disappeared, they're lost, and we're frantic, and we're like, oh, if only they would come back. And then when they come back, and they're just fine, thank you very much, they were just kind of hanging out at their friend's house or at the mall, we get pretty angry. And most of us. Anyway, we forget all about how precious they are. We get mad. I get mad at the cat when he does that. Anyway, here we go. Jesus' parents, not abused, right? So they scolded him, and Jesus, who he really doesn't appear to have been willfully disobedient, he just seems kind of confused by all of this. He says, well, why were you even searching for me? Didn't you know I must be in my Father's house? And that word for house, it sort of means house, or it means things, or it means business. It's kind of, well, didn't you know I was doing my Father's stuff? This is all about my Father's stuff. Yeah. So he asked them that. Well, okay. Adolescence, which is where he was, it's a special time, not an easy time. It's one of those times of discovery, exploration, pulling away, reaching for some measure of independence, and learning responsibility and new roles in relationships. It's definitely one of those liminal times, one of my favorite words again, a transitional time. Sometimes it's even dangerous. Honestly, I love that age group of kids, and I often find myself teaching young people in this group. I know plenty of educators who teach middle school, and almost every one of them will tell you that it is a particular calling in itself. Typically, other things happen at that age. Confirmation in churches, it occurs then. This is when the young person studies more about their church and about their own particular fellowship, and they affirm the vows done at their baptism. There's the bar and bat mitzvahs from our Jewish heritage. And of course there's the secular ones too, the coming of age stuff, the first dance, the driver's license, graduation, first job. All of that stuff happens during this developmental period of children as they move through adolescence, becoming an adult member of the community. So here, in one of these few stories told of his life, before Jesus launched into his full-on ministry, we meet an adolescent Jesus who doesn't seem to be any easier to relate to than a normal adolescent. The other story found in Luke's account is also a story when Jesus was presented in the table as an infant. So, okay, the family went to see Passover, went to observe the holiday, time to head home. Jesus has disappeared without asking, let alone informing his parents of his plans. This is all kind of a jarring leap for the first Sunday after Christmas, in a year when we just encountered Jesus as a baby, day before yesterday, night before last. Luke presents the opening parts of Jesus' life, the birth narrative and the formative years of Jesus. He presents everything as sort of a series of journeys for Jesus, journeys for his parents, and for the other people who encounter him, like Elizabeth, the shepherds, Simeon, Anna. Even the angel Gabriel has been sent by God. No one just pops up. They don't just show up randomly. They set out and arrive in the various places touched by this story of the child Jesus entering the world. These instances aren't chance things. They weren't generated randomly. There is a divine order at work, connected to the holy places of the people found in the feasts and the festival, the city of Jerusalem and the temple. The first couple of chapters of Luke also have a lot of prophetic utterances that the characters involved narrate the action of which they are a part. Not only does the angel speak for God, Elizabeth, Mary, Zechariah, Simeon, and Anna all proclaim the coming of Jesus. And in this week's passage, guess who we finally hear from? Jesus. It's a very human exchange between mother and child. Oh, why were you looking for me? I was right here. So now, imagine the parents' fear for their son. They thought he was safe in the caravan, just to discover he's missing. We've all seen a Lifetime movie or two about that. They must have been panicking, praying, desperately hoping they'd find him. Too many families have experienced that without this good outcome. But this story is distinct. It's unusual because of who Jesus is and of what this moment is about. Right as he's about to transition into adulthood, this annual pilgrimage into Jerusalem for Passover, it gives us a little preview of what's coming up. For the first time, Jesus actually speaks. And in his speaking, he reveals his awareness of his unique relation to God. Jesus' presence among the teachers in the temple and the confrontation there between the youth Jesus and his parents exhibit his remarkable wisdom. But above all, the thing that shows up here is his recognition that he is God's son, and that this family affiliation overrides all other connections. Now, this event doesn't yet launch Jesus into ministry. More likely, this story got told by Mary to the disciples a long time after Jesus' earthly ministry concluded. It's told from Mary's point of view, and she understands its significance. All the elements in this that were described would have been pretty cemented in her memory of these events. Memory, kind of a funny thing. It rarely matches the original events, unless, of course, you're watching the TV show Unforgettable. Memories, for most of us, get distorted by time, influenced by other experiences. Memories that some of us hold really closely get forgotten by others because they didn't have the same impact on them. This episode in the private life of Jesus and his parents betrays that Jesus, his power, his ministry, and the revelation of him, it all shows up in stages. It was a process, and Luke details it in really meticulous steps. That's kind of different from last year's main gospel, Mark, who was in such a hurry that he didn't even bother with the early years. He started with the baptism of Jesus. There's a famous radio and television host. Now, some of you younger folks won't remember him, but I do, Monty Hall. Who remembers Monty Hall?
Yes.
Yes. He said this. I love this. Actually, I am an overnight success. It just took 20 years. Luke shows Jesus through Mary's eyes as the one who was closest to him and had moment after moment of discovery with him. In this story, we're eavesdropping on a pretty pivotal conversation. Why did you do this to us? Why did you make us so afraid? Why were you even looking for me, Mom? You should know where I was. I used to love to read biographies when I was a kid. I still like to read biographies. But if you've ever read biographies of famous men, you probably noticed that the usual style was to portray them as children already exhibiting the character they were going to manifest as adult heroes. For me, the one that shows up a lot in this is George Washington and the cherry tree. And of course you have Lincoln and the cabin and reading and all of those. But every time I would read one of these aimed at kids biography books, the person being, biographed? Is that a word? Anyway. Always shows as a kid, they look like they're just as wise as they were as an adult. Luke is the only one among the canonical Gospels who follows this as a similar practice, relating this scene from his youth that he's showing all this wisdom in the temple. This scene builds a bridge to his adult life. It shows him with a sharp focus on his identity and vocation as the Son of God. And that awareness brings him into conflict with his parents. And the resulting confirmation gives us his first words in the gospel, that he was about his Father's business. Luke's narrative of the story pretty much focuses on that one thing: Jesus' precocious understanding of himself. as a son not of Joseph and Mary, but as a son of God. That's the family to which he ultimately belongs, the one that defines his identity and his vocation and claims his allegiance. So, we all know Mary chastises him, and his response might seem kind of impertinent to our ears, and maybe they did to Mary at the time. But I took another look at it, and I thought, could these have been words of assurance? Could Jesus actually have been revealing himself to them in a deeper way in this private moment? Because he knew that Mary was going to have an especially difficult journey once his ministry became public. Maybe he wanted to give his mother an inside view of what her life was about, a little bit of a warning, what he would ultimately become. The text explains that Joseph and Mary didn't get it. They didn't understand the fullness of this message, at least not in that moment. But still, that conversation was essential to all the events that went before and came after it. The heart of the passage, the point, is Jesus' response to Mary's question. Why were you looking for me? Do you not know that I must be in my Father's house? It was sort of a I was not lost declaration. The Father-Son claim was first made, here's these steps from Luke, was first made by the angel of the Annunciation, and of course by Mary, as she spoke with Elizabeth. And here it's made by Jesus himself, and it will come again in the voice of God at the baptism in the next chapter. Although Jesus willingly obeys his earth parents, his obligation is established as God's Son. Luke gives us this insight into history. Think about it again, this continuity. The infant Jesus, to the boy Jesus, to the Jesus of ministry, to the risen Jesus. After the "why did you think I was lost" conversation, there's this notation that Jesus was obedient to Mary and Joseph. Seems a little odd, but it really isn't in contrast to the dialogue expressed in the passage. At first it might look like it, but instead what it really does is it reinforces the character of Jesus. He says, well, I was about my Father's business, but you're right, I'm going to come home with you and I'll be a good son. It kind of counters our natural inclination to suspect that this teenager, or almost teenager anyway, was being disrespectful or confrontational. Instead, what he was doing was being true to self, and he was living out the mission he was called to fulfill with awareness, and he was sharing that awareness as an act of respect to his earthly parents. There's a song that we heard in our Christmas Eve service. It's played a lot this time of year, called Mary, Did You Know? It speculates on whether Mary understood the significance of her baby boy or knew what was to come from his life. Well, it seems clear from the Magnificat that Mary prophesied about Jesus. She points out his entrance into the world as a disruptive and transformative force. A force that will bring about the rule and reign of the Holy One over the oppressive powers of this world. But you know, in the routine of living a life of caring for a child, from changing dirty diapers to a family trip observing a religious festival, I imagine that the wonder of the Sovereign One's promise loses a bit of its prominence to the mundane requirements and responsibilities of daily living. Many of us are considering this text today. It's a weird quirk of the calendar that few of us always appreciate. There's no break. We worship on Christmas Eve, and we left worship with the baby only to turn right back around and enter into this sacred space. Just as Mary and Joseph had to turn right back around and head to the temple to find Jesus. Sometimes we don't find Jesus in big mega celebrations of the festival or giant, what I call Hollywood Jesus shows. Sometimes we don't locate Jesus even within the companionship of family gatherings when there's too much division. Sometimes we have to search for an encounter after the big day has ended and we're supposed to return to our routine and normal lives. Sometimes we have to find Jesus in every little bit of our life. Sometimes we don't get it the first time. There's a lot we don't understand. But at the same time, when we reconnect with Jesus, we find that he wasn't lost. Why did you think I was lost? He wasn't lost. Jesus was right there in the holy space that we carry, the space that's in our hearts and our minds and our spirit and our strength. Not lost. Found. So much treasure has been found. Jesus is right here, right now, in this time. Amazing love and amazing grace. Amen.